Mr. Knightley and Harriet Smith. It was a union to distance every wonder of the kind. Such an elevation on her side, such a debasement on his. It was horrible to Emma to think how it must sink him in the general opinion, to foresee the smiles, the sneers, the merriment it would prompt at his expense, the mortification and disdain of his brother, the thousand inconveniences to himself. Could it be? No, it was impossible. And yet it was far, very far from impossible.
Ho-ri-o, 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 ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we are reading Jane Austen's Emma.
Austen at last. I've been trying to talk you into this for ages.
Well, it took us 28 episodes, but we finally made it to an Austen. I certainly wasn't kicking and screaming to read this. I'm very fond of Austen, or at least I remember being very fond of her.
When did you first read her novels?
I first read her novels when I was about, let's say 2021.
Mm-hmm.
I read all of them except one. I saved one, sort of put one of them, the last one I happened to find a cheap used copy of. I put it sort of behind glass to break in case of emergency. Sometimes you want to save a treat for later. That treat for me is Mansfield Park, which I'm told is not the tastiest of the treats I could have saved for myself. But some people like it. I don't know. I haven't read it. I have not actually read any Austen again for quite a while, probably since my 20s, except for the one that I keep returning to every so often, which is Northanger Abbey, which is just a funny book, and I delight in it.
That's interesting. I was just going to ask you which one was your favorite. It's embarrassing, but Pride and Prejudice is still my favorite. I know that that's like kitschy and embarrassing, guilty pleasure, but every once in a while I'm down, I'm, not having a very good week or whatever, and like that's the book that does it.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I think at the time Emma was my favorite, but again, it's been about 20 years. I should reread all of them. Maybe we'll get around to all of them sooner rather than later.
Some people say Persuasion is the best one, but I find it like poignant. I find it hard to read. I find it not pleasurable to read, even though I admire the skill of it.
Yeah, I don't remember anything about Persuasion. I know I've read it. I don't remember anything, but that's beside the point. That's my own inability to retain plot details. So
now we chose Emma. Do you want to say something about why we chose that one?
We chose it because Pride and Prejudice seemed a bit too obvious to be our first Austen, and we're a little perverse that way, I suppose. It was also my favorite, as I said, when I first read them, so I was most excited about revisiting that. A movie just came out called Emma with a period, which is kind of interesting. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. We also decided that we wanted to do a cluster, which this is the first book of, on 19th century British novels, which also meant that we were going to be doing a cluster about class. And I have to say, I sort of said that originally a bit jokingly, but rereading Emma, wow, is this a novel about class? It's everywhere.
All the time. And it's neat to think about the ways in which, like you said, 19th century British novel, distant in time, distant from the world we inhabit. And yet at the same time, thinking about inequity, thinking about how people manage their place in society, how economic pressures inflect people's sense of where they are and what's possible for them. That doesn't feel far away from our moment at all.
No. And the other thing that I found is that while it's not that I've never read or thought about class issues or how people talk about class, but there were situations that were coming up in this novel that I realized I didn't have an adequate vocabulary or theoretical framework for talking about, right? Like there are ways that class affects the characters' lives and their interactions, which I can talk about, but which I don't have. I don't feel secure in how I talk about them because I'm presumably just underread on this. Which is my own fault. But yeah, it's just woven so deeply within the novel.
And I wonder how much of that is a question of studying more about 19th century class structures, and how much of that has to do with whether you grow up within a society where subtle gradations of class really matter and continue to matter. Class is always around us, is always going on in certain ways. I'm not pretending that it's absent in any way, but the kind of fine distinctions and that constant policing, I can't say that's something I have an intuitive understanding of.
No, it's something I grew up fairly oblivious to as well. Not to say it didn't affect anything, but I was not raised in the sport of judging or fearing being judged for slight class differences and keeping up with the Joneses and all that. That just wasn't how we rolled.
Yeah. And so it makes these fine distinctions not so legible. I think that's the difference, right? Do you grow up in an environment where these fine distinctions are legible and constantly being policed? Or is it a kind of a second language, right? To keep the metaphor going that you pick up later on.
Well, we should start by giving a little plot summary for those who haven't read Emma or haven't read it recently. Of course, there's going to be spoilers, but it's fine. You'll see every twist coming. So, Emma Woodhouse, our main protagonist, is the nearly 21-year-old unmarried daughter of the poshest family in the town of Highbury. And she's recently seen her dear former governess get married. And she believes that she was responsible for the excellent match. And so she's ready to try it again. And soon she meets Harriet Smith, a pleasant young girl at a local boarding school whose origins are shrouded in mystery. And therefore, Emma thinks, she must be of pretty high status. So she tells Harriet to refuse an offer of marriage from Mr. Martin, who, even though he's a good and caring man, is just a mere farmer. Instead, she decides to set Harriet up with a local hottie, Mr. Elton. And it seems like everything is going well. But surprise, surprise, it turns out Elton is more interested in Emma than her little friend Harriet. Emma, scandalized and embarrassed to be wooed by Mr. Elton, refuses his advances. Two other characters then appear, Jane Fairfax, who's about Emma's age and who Emma has fixated upon as a rival, and Frank Churchill, who was adopted by rich relatives when he was quite young and who has never returned to the town, Highbury, to visit his biological father, and who therefore Emma has fixated upon as a gentleman of great interest. The matchmaking machinations are set. Does Frank Churchill love Emma? Does she love him? What about Emma's brother-in-law and intellectual sparring partner, Mr. Knightley? Is he in love with Jane Fairfax? And would this mean disaster? Oh, and what will become of poor Harriet? After a series of dinners, balls, and outings, the results aren't too surprising. Frank ends up with Jane, Emma with Knightley, and Harriet marries the long-suffering farmer Mr. Martin after all. Happy endings all around.
Like you said, a lot of this you can see coming as the novel unfolds. There are very few real surprises.
Yeah, it's certainly treated as if you don't know what's going to come. And there's a lot of intentional misdirection, but it's much more about the cringe of Emma or some of the other characters not knowing that they're wrong about the world, about how they perceive the world. And that's where a lot of the comedy comes from. But you, the reader, are kind of in on the whole thing, even though you aren't explicitly told. Like, there is definitely the capacity to being surprised if you're unfamiliar with how Jane Austen novels tend to work. But most readers will probably figure it all out.
Yeah, you kind of know what the shape of this plot is likely to be. You know, it's like, I don't know, a Shakespeare comedy or something like that. You know people are going to pair off. You know there's going to be a happy ending. You know, you have some sense of where it's going. One of the things that's kind of striking about it, though, is the extent to which you get a pleasure out of watching, you know, Emma be wrong. Because she's not stupid. She's actually incredibly clever. But she's wrong a lot of times. And you, the reader, know enough frequently to see that she's wrong, and yet you're not unsympathetic to her. You don't feel like, oh, she's an idiot. You're frustrated by her being wrong. You're kind of with her even when you know she's wrong, and in that sense, you're kind of like Mr. Knightley, right?
I suppose so. I found myself not as with her as I might have been. I found, not that I was thinking that she was an idiot or anything, but I found her kind of monstrous at times in her capacity to try to foist her will upon the world, whether it wanted it or not. She's not the worst offender in the novel at that, but we'll get to that in a bit. But yes, I'm certainly not as sympathetic to her. She's not the character that I thought, oh, she's great. She's a great person. She just has these little flaws, but everybody does.
Is there another character in the novel that you feel is more sympathetic, you know, whose subject position you're happy to inhabit?
Absolutely. The character that I would most want to spend time with and the character that I want to hear more about is Harriet.
Oh my God, she's so boring.
She's very simple-minded, and she has her little pleasures, and she falls in love very easily and very intensely. But there is something that is just delightful about her. Her guilelessness, I don't know. There's something very nice. She's the opposite of Emma in that sense, that she's not nearly that interested in imposing her will upon the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like she's simple in the sense that she's uncalculating. And I don't know, I have a sweet spot for that sometimes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that's true. And she appreciates what comes her way. I mean, she's guileless
sometimes too much, but yes.
So, should I talk a little about bio stuff if I get to it?
Sure. I mean, Jane Austen is I think, a very popular author, and I think most people know about her works, but it's definitely worth refreshing a little bit.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the weird situation we had when we were doing Shakespeare's Tempest. It felt really weird to do a sort of bio overview because Austen, you know, while inhabiting a very different place in the landscape from Shakespeare, is also, you know, a fixed point in the constellation of books you end up reading at one point sooner or later, at least in most sort of educational environments. And there's not a whole lot to tell about her life. She had a short life. She was only 41 years old when she died. And she started publishing relatively late in life, in her 30s. But during that less than a decade, she completed and published 6 novels, 2 of which actually came out after her death, but she'd finished them. And then there was another 7th unfinished novel, as well as some juvenilia that later on got published. And these books are famous, quite a lot of them, or at least some of them having been adapted into films. Sense and Sensibility came out first, then Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and then Emma. And Emma is the last of her novels that came out in her lifetime. The 2 that came out after her death were Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, published posthumously in 1818. She also was a huge writer of letters, though we have very few of these. We know she wrote a lot because we have in some cases the other side of the correspondence or references to her writing. But her sister, Cassandra, to whom she was very close, destroyed the vast majority of these letters after her death. And, while you can respect the desire to maintain privacy, right, you have to respect that. On the other hand, it's tantalizing how much has been lost.
So a lot of the characters in Austen's novels are, how would you describe them, landed gentry, or, people who are not nobility necessarily, but definitely have a fair amount of money and land and estates and all that. Was Austen a part of that class, or is she just looking on?
Well, no, she's in a very interesting area of that class, right? As opposed to sort of nobility or aristocracy, people who are both rich enough and secure enough in their social position not to need to worry too much about how they're seen. She's part of this, as you said, this landed gentry class. Her father was a clergyman from a respectable family, but a poor branch, right? So good family, as one would say, right? And her mother came from a slightly more stable part of the country gentry. So they're that gentleman class. There's this memorable moment in Austen's Pride and Prejudice where Elizabeth Bennet is getting hassled by a relative about aspiring to, she thinks, marry Mr. Darcy. And Elizabeth says, he is a gentleman. I am a gentleman's daughter. So far, we are both equal. And that's a really interesting moment because it gives you the sense that even when there's a big inequity in terms of money, like an economic inequity, there's still this class common ground of gentleman status. And so anyway, so her family is part of that environment. An interesting detail that I noticed was that Austen's mother's family had an interesting experience. Her older brother, James, inherited a fortune and a large estate from a relative of theirs, their great aunt. But he had to change his name from Perrault to Lee Perrault. And that's just very much like what we see in Emma with Frank Churchill, originally born Weston, and he's sort of adopted into another part of the family and takes on this different last name. So this idea that there are trade-offs that happen in this world where in exchange for money and especially status, you may have to give up other parts of what makes you you, like other family connections. So Jane was part of a very large family of 8 children. She's the second to last child. Basically, her mother was most of the time having a baby every year. I was reading these dates going, oh, cringe. Yeah. And after her father's death, Austen continued to live with her mother along with her sister Cassandra, and they had real financial problems. Like when you see the Bates family, who we'll probably talk about here in Emma, is a family who's, relatively stable socially, but then has financial setbacks and have to live in a straitened way. This is an experience that is part of Austen's biography as well. So she'd been writing from very early on. We see from letters that survive, she was writing from teenage years and reading her work to her family. And the first of her novels to be published, Sense and Sensibility, she managed to get it anonymously published, with her brother being the go-between to the publisher. And her name wasn't on the book. It's just got on the title page, by a lady. And then her later novels, when they get published, the author line says, by the author of Sense and Sensibility. So she never has her name on her books in her lifetime. And it's just interesting thinking about the position of the woman writer, able to be published, and even as by a lady, right? Like that this was somehow an authorizing thing, like added to the value of the book in some ways, that it was by a lady. But you would never want to be known as somebody who wrote a book, right? As something so commercial as to write a book. And her work was pretty popular already in her own lifetime, not hugely popular, but pretty popular. Went out of print very briefly in the 1820s, but then by the 1830s, it starts getting republished and takes on more and more of a following. So much so that by the late 19th century, you get Leslie Stevens, who was Virginia Woolf's father, a famous critic, biographer. In 1876, he's writing about Austen, and he refers to the Austenolatry of his time.
Of people idolizing the idolatry towards Austen.
Yeah, exactly. So there's clearly a fan base already in the 1870s. It's not just that it's read as literature, it's got fans. And that's kind of interesting, I think.
Yeah, especially because that fandom is so strongly marks how people think of her work today. Like even if she's taken seriously as a writer, it's not that she isn't thought well of within the academy or within literary circles or anything, but she has a massive fan base.
Yeah, Janeites, right? That's what they tend to get called, right? I don't know if that's a pejorative term or not, but yeah, there's like a phenomenon as well as the scholarly reputation, which is like fascinating.
So I've described Emma as a bit of a monster, but I'm not sure mine is the majority view of the readership. What do you think of Emma? What is she like?
Well, I think you're right to see her as having these monstrous qualities. She's formidable in the sense that she's very clever. She's quick. Like there are a couple of moments in the novel where something's going on. Somebody's talking to her. It's maybe Mr. Elton or Mr. Knightley or one of the women that she's talking to. And she's thinking out all this other stuff that we get narration of. So we could tell that she's somebody who's like really quick in the uptake, but educated only in the most moderate kind of way. Like she hasn't been challenged adequately. There's this really interesting moment when she's going to draw a picture of Harriet as a way of building the love of Mr. Elton for Harriet. And she takes out the drawings that she had done over time. And there's a really interesting passage that tells you something about Emma's quality of mind. It says this: Emma wished to go to work directly and therefore produced the portfolio containing her various attempts at portraits, for not one of them had ever been finished, that they might decide together on the best size for Harriet. Her many beginnings were displayed. Miniatures, half-lengths, whole-lengths, pencil, crayon, and watercolors had all been tried in turn. She had always wanted to do everything, and had made more progress both in drawing and music than many might have done with so little labor as she would ever submit to. And then there's other passages that talk about her, like she sort of feels bad that she's not better at, performing music than she is. And so she practices for like half an hour after that.
Knightley makes fun of her for, since she was 12 years old, constantly drawing up lists of books that she means to read and not getting more than a few pages through any of them.
Exactly. So like she's somebody who's got this capacity for intellectual achievements, right? But whether it's because she's lazy or because she hasn't been educated in that way, she's had a governess, but it hasn't been very oriented toward, anything more than a lady would need for it. So she's this odd underexploited potentiality, right? And that has to go somewhere. And so where it goes is trying to sort of set up romantic relationships for other people and kind of assuming that everybody else is just going to fall into place like a bunch of playthings. And it's kind of monstrous, but it's also kind of poignant, right? I mean, this is a woman who in another age could do almost anything, right? But she's got in some ways she's very free, but in some ways she's got a very, very circumscribed world. So I feel bad for her. Reading her now, I feel bad for her.
Well, absolutely. I agree with all that.
But she is kind of monstrous too.
But she is kind of monstrous. It's also fascinating how, the book starts off with her thinking that she has successfully landed her governess with a very respectable match. Definitely she married up. But Knightley immediately says, I'm not actually sure you had anything to do with that. and we're encouraged to think, well, maybe she isn't actually very good at this. Maybe she doesn't have the effect on the world that she thinks she does. But the entire rest of the novel is propelled by her trying out this gift that she has that maybe she isn't actually very good at, and indeed proves to be not very good at it throughout the novel.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's not just that she's lazy. It's that, she's very smart, but she's not self-disciplined enough to recognize the limits of her talents or the qualities of her talents.
Yeah. She has very little scope to maneuver, right? She lives at home with her father. Her older sister is already married and moved to London. Her mother's been dead since she was a child. She had this governess, but the governess is married. But Emma's grown up, obviously, right? But then the governess has, married and moved elsewhere in the town. And she's at home with her father, a father that, I was going to say she can't leave, right? But it's true that she can't leave, but also she doesn't want to. She truly loves him and he loves her. But he's described in the book as a valetudinarian, somebody who is continuously preoccupied with his health, his own health and other people's health. In the same way that Emma is constantly trying to micromanage other people's lives, her father also is trying to micromanage everybody else's, diet and health.
The food stuff in particular is amazing.
Oh my God, it's so funny.
He's just constantly having people over for dinner and then telling them, you just want the thin gruel. That's all you want.
Yeah, just a very little bit.
Oh, you eat your food heated? Like, that's no good for you.
And your baked apples have to be baked at least 3 times.
Yes, scandalized when he finds out that Other people bake them only twice. So Mr. Woodhouse, her father, is much more along this line of thinking that the way he wants to live his life is the way that everyone else should live their life, and that they're going to just follow suit. And Emma has a bit of this. It doesn't seem to be nearly as severe as it is with her father.
Well, with him, it's comic, right? Like, it's absurd. It's one of the funny things in the novel, right? There's all these passages that, come up where he's trying to manage people in this way. But this idea that, it's a kind of a failure of imagination, right? It's that, the way I see the world must surely be the way that you also see the world.
Exactly.
And in Mr. Woodhouse, it's just ridiculous. And Emma, it's slightly different because it's almost like a moral dilemma. Is she going to learn to not be like that? Is she going to learn the limits of her own judgment? And she does seem to have a capacity to learn.
It's interesting because it's comic relief with him, right? He's there. Every scene he's in, he's ridiculous. He is immediately doing silly things and saying ridiculous things, and everybody's reacting to him. He is a character actor type role. And with her, it's also meant to be funny, right? We're also supposed to find it amusing that she's wrong about things and gets herself and other people in these predicaments. But it's much more spread out over the course of the novel.
And people do get hurt. I mean, Harriet at least, right?
Oh, absolutely. And there are emotional consequences to it. And she does have a character arc of growing over the course of the novel. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting to see that, like, they have the same joke, kind of, but it's a very fast-paced joke for him that doesn't change, and it's a much more spread out joke for her.
No, I think that's right. So she's got this relationship with her father, which, again, it's got two sides to it. On the face of it, it's charming, it's sweet. She's devoted to him. He's devoted to her. But it's created an environment where she's in a way almost kind of trapped. She refers at one point to never being more than 2 hours from Highbury. So she always has to be within reach for her father, right? She can't go away. And she talks at one point about never having seen the sea, never having been to the ocean. And it's kind of poignant. And then at the very end of the novel, we learn, when she has her happy ending with Mr. Knightley, they managed to go away for 2 weeks to the seaside, right? So she's had this, like, she's been on a tether kind of always. And that says something really interesting about her too. She's kind of straining at that tether in some ways, not so much to have physical freedom for herself, but to be able to act on the world.
So when she meets Harriet, she finds somebody who is well suited for her to act upon.
Well, Harriet is a kind of a replacement, right?
It's a project. I mean, yes, Harriet is a replacement for the governess who's married and left her immediate circle.
Who would become like her best friend, right? So she needs a new best friend.
Well, she needs a new project, right? Like, it is interesting. Like, yes, they are friends, but she clearly transitioned to thinking of Mrs. Weston, the now Mrs. Weston, her former governess, as a project who she managed to get married off well. And now she needs a new project. And she looks at Harriet much more as a project of somebody who she can improve and get placed in another successful marriage, much more than like an equal.
Yeah, there's a beautiful description of this. I remember being so struck by it, by the replacement-like quality of it. She was quite convinced of Harriet Smith's being exactly the young friend she wanted, exactly the something which her home required. Such a friend as Mrs. Weston was out of the question. Two such could never be granted. Two such she did not want. It was quite a different sort of thing, a sentiment distinct and independent. Mrs. Weston was the object of a regard which had its basis in gratitude and esteem. Harriet would be loved as one to whom she could be useful. For Mrs. Weston, there was nothing to be done. For Harriet, everything.
Exactly.
It's so weird.
It's also weird because, of course, Mrs. Weston was her governess, i.e. a paid worker in the house. And it's always remarkable. Mr. Woodhouse, Emma's father, is just shocked that she would marry and leave their loving home where she was one of the family, the one of the family who actually had to do chores and do work and get paid for it or get remuneration for it. But yeah, no, there's a real sense in which Emma cannot see her former nanny, former governess, as in that kind of worker-employer relationship, that they are, to her, just friends. And they are friends.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a very complicated blurring of those relations, right?
Yeah, no, it is clearly more complicated than that, but it doesn't seem to enter her mind at all that it's a possibility that it could be anything other than.
And we see a whole bunch of moments in the novel that invite us to think about that problem, the ways in which a paid worker-employer relationship is simultaneously understood as a familial relationship or not. So, for example, with Mrs. Weston, so she had been Emma's governess. Then once Emma's old enough to not really need a governess, she stays on in the household nonetheless because they're such intimate friends. She's a kind of a companion to her at that point. So there's still an economic relation, but it's also an intimate family-like relation. And also in some ways, almost a quasi-maternal relation. There are moments where Mrs. Weston refers to having, tried to provide that place because she'd been with Emma from a very young age, right? Where her mother had died, right? So there's a quasi, almost familial relation. And then later, once Mrs. Weston gets married and becomes the stepmother of Frank Churchill, who's had to change his name, even though his father's last name was Weston. So he's been adopted by a wealthy relative. And so he's now got the last name Churchill. Mrs. Weston is the stepmother to Frank Churchill, who might possibly become a suitor of Emma. And the Westons actually really try to encourage this formation of a relationship. And if that had taken place, Emma would have become actually a stepdaughter, right, through marriage to Mrs. Weston. So there's all these weird family relations and potential family relations. But then we get reminded later on in the novel with the case of Jane Fairfax, who's, of good family, had a good education, been, brought up well, but has no money. She's going to have to become a governess. And she's horrified at this prospect for a number of reasons, which we could talk about. This is a horrible prospect to her. And she understands this as kind of the end of her possible future happiness, like her ability to sort of inhabit the class that she was born to. So on the one hand, we're encouraged to sort of see, with Mrs. Weston, we're encouraged to see a kind of a blurriness between the worker-employer relationship on the one hand and the family relationship on the other. In the case of Jane Fairfax, we're reminded that, no, that's actually a pretty hard and fast line that's very difficult to cross.
Exactly. There's an intensely striking bit of dialogue around that when Jane is being proposed a position as a governess at a very high-ranking place. And she feels anxiety about it for various reasons. But she said, if you're worried, if you mean that your potential future employer is part of the slave trade, she's told, no, he's always been a friend to abolition. And Jane says, I was not thinking of the slave trade. Governess trade, I assure you, is all I had in view. Widely different, certainly, as to the guilt of those who carry it on. But as to the greater misery of the victims, I do not know where it lies. Which is a
not
lot.
Quite the same. No.
I'm not gonna vouch for the accuracy of that sentiment.
No,
but I will say that if it's even mentally somewhere in the ballpark, right? If being a governess is something that you could consider even remotely as bad as a slave trade, which it's not, but if that's even something that's thinkable, it means something about what it means to be a governess. And it also means something about what Mrs. Weston's relationship was when she was a governess. Now, obviously, she's clearly not that upset about the Woodhouses or anything like that. It was not destroying to her at all. But
that's not because the governess role doesn't have the potential to be incredibly destructive, right? Like, in other words, we're meant to see that as a very positive example of how that can go. And yet there's also other ways it can go. And it's through Jane Fairfax's eyes that we get a glimpse of what that could be. Because she's also not a stupid character. I mean, her anxiety about becoming a governess is inflected by her hope to get married to Frank Churchill, right? But she's not wrong to see that as a potentially really awful state of life.
Yeah, it's very interesting. That is a particularly weird thing, but it does seem like Emma would never, it seems like Emma herself would never think of the slave trade at all.
That's the only time that it enters in, I think, if I remember correctly, to the novel. The other, we're talking about the slave trade here, reminds me of this other really super weird and super jarring moment in the text. And I wonder if it struck you as it struck me. Gypsies. What the hell is going on there? There's this one moment where Harriet is said to have been accosted by gypsies, by a bunch of children and I think a woman and then an older boy who are pestering her for change and she has to be rescued from them. And I'm like, what was that?
Yeah, that was a very odd scene. And I don't know quite what was, plot-wise, it's creating a situation of some stakes, I guess, that she can be rescued from by Frank Churchill, which can lead to a misunderstanding, yada, 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 plot happens.
Yeah, it is a plot point, but it's also really weird. In other words, to some extent, this novel is not just a portrait of a person, Emma. It's also a portrait of the town. And this is a town with gypsies in it, right? So
Yeah, who we don't generally hear about and who are terrifying, even though in the description of what they do, it doesn't sound like anything anyone should be terrified of. They
mhm.
are a bit aggressive in asking for money, is perhaps the worst way you can frame it. And Harriet freaks out, has no idea how to handle this or walk away or anything,
Uh-huh.
and as you said, has to be rescued.
Yeah.
It's like, that seems like such a wild overreaction that it seems like it's a satire.
Yeah, perhaps a satire. It'd be interesting to know more about that, but also perhaps a way of representing like the danger that lies at the edge of class respectability. You know, Harriet is someone who's kind of right at the edge of this gentry class, right? Emma has great aspirations for Harriet. Harriet herself pretty much has the aspirations to be, married into the yeoman farmer class, right? So not quite the gentry, sort of at the edge of it. But she's on that threshold of respectability, right? Of entry into those classes. And so maybe that scene is meant to be the sort of specter of what can drag you away. But it struck me as a very bizarre scene, especially because you get another reference to gypsies in a kind of metaphorical way not too long after.
Yes, where Mrs. Elton, the person who eventually marries the man that...
Oh my God, she's so pretentious.
She's awful. The man that Harriet was originally set up to be with, she's an outsider who is desperately trying to assert her status within the town that she's just moved to, and it doesn't go well. And she's,
oh my God, all the time.
She is a complete monster with no redeeming qualities. She arranges for there to be a little bit of a picnic at Mr. Knightley's estate amidst his strawberries. And she has a very particular idea of what it should be like. And she describes it as there is to be no form or parade, a sort of gypsy party. Now,
by which she means that she's going to wear a casual outfit and carry a basket. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, but it's like that this is a fashion, that gypsy identity is also understood as a fashion statement, like not that much later in the novel, like a couple chapters later.
No, exactly. But I'm not sure whether this is meant to show that Mrs. Elton doesn't really know the history of all the people that are around her, because Harriet's there as part of this party. She's hearing that, oh, now we will be a gypsy party. And this is sort of, and so if you take what happened to Harriet seriously, you'd never say that to her, right?
No.
That would just be reminding her of past trauma, which probably shouldn't have been that traumatic. But, and in many ways isn't. Harriet seems basically fine by it the next day.
Yeah, in that way, it would be a way for us to see who knows what about whom, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Mrs. Elton is continuing to not fit in and not realize how badly she doesn't fit in.
That's true. That makes sense.
So that's, I think, why that comes back. But it is definitely weird, especially, reading it as more of a pejorative term as we would now than I assume Austen and her readers would at the time.
Oh, yeah.
But as you say, that is another set of people who are in the town who aren't really reckoned with over the course of the novel. They're just there.
Yeah. Well, with the town, what we do is we get to know the people Emma knows, right? So people who inhabit different rungs on the social ladder, but all of whom are acceptable in some way or the other to this landed gentry that Emma and her father belong to, right? So her near neighbor, Mr. Knightley, is on intimate terms. He comes over, walks over and visits with the father and with Emma regularly. Mr. Knightley's brother, John, is married to Emma's sister, Isabella. So there's a family connection there as well. There are other people. There's the Westons, who are connected by Mrs. Weston having been the governess to Emma in the past. And there's clearly long-term, long-standing friendships, like the friendship that unites Mrs. Bates and Miss Bates, and then their niece, Jane Fairfax, because the older Mrs. Bates, Mr. Woodhouse has known her for a long, long, long time. So these are clearly like social relations that are on a very firm footing that have existed for many years. Even though in economic terms, these people inhabit totally different places in the landscape.
Well, it's also interesting that we should talk a bit about the Bateses. But before we do that, I also want to remember that she does pay a visit to a very poor family at one point in the novel. And she checks in on them, basically. They're not doing well. She does a sort of, I'm visiting you. Charity visit, walking away, feeling better. There's some fabulous line about how, you just feel so good after you see poor people. Yeah. It's like, oh my word, no, you're the worst. You're the worst, Emma.
It's terrible.
But there's also when Harriet is interested in marrying Mr. Martin, the farmer, a young farmer, she says, is the very last sort of person to raise my curiosity. A degree or two lower, and a creditable appearance might interest me. I might hope to be useful to their families in some way or another, but a farmer can need none of my help. and is therefore, in one sense, as much above my notice as every other he is below it.
Whoa.
I could never have visited Mrs. Robert Barton of Abbey Mill Farm. Like, she could not make a social call to the Martins because they're at exactly the wrong place. They are not high enough and not low enough for her to visit.
It's such a chilling scene, right? Because, I mean, Emma is supposedly very best friends with Harriet here. And what she's basically saying is that if you had married Robert Martin, I could not have, known you socially. I could not have said hi to you. Couldn't have paid a call on you. Couldn't, talk to you in the street. And I remember being like, whoa, like Emma's representing this as, that's just the way things are. I couldn't do it.
I think it's important to note, though, that I'm not sure everybody agrees with her. Like, I don't think Mr. Knightley would agree at all. He visits. No. He's not that much lower than Emma on the social rankings, it seems. I'm not sure.
I don't. And also his house appears kind of more venerable in some ways.
It's got better strawberries.
It's got better strawberries. And it's like really like, there's a beautiful description of the house that gives you a sense of it being like really old and established. So I would hesitate to think that the Woodhouses are above the Knightleys. The Knightleys look solid, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the Woodhouses certainly think they're above the Knightleys, but not much. But Mr. Knightley visits Mr. Martin and consults with him about the potential marriage with Harriet Smith. Like, he does visit them. There doesn't seem to be any real reason why Emma couldn't, as far as I can tell.
I wonder if a bit of that is gendered. Like here, I just don't know enough about how the policing of class boundaries breaks down in gender terms. Like, I wonder if women are understood to be kind of policed by and policing those boundaries more vigorously.
It does seem like that's the case sometimes, certainly in terms of who can visit who without raising suspicion. But it does also generally seem that Mr. Knightley doesn't think that Emma is right in terms of her extreme policing.
Like for men, they can be occupied on business, right? And in fact, with Robert Martin, that's exactly what happens because Robert Martin is a farmer, right? And so Knightley's got all this land. And so, it totally makes sense that they have, business type conversation to have, right? But for women, it's always leisure, right? Unless you're on a mission of charity of some sort, right? It's always leisure when you're paying a call on somebody or they're paying a call on you. And that reciprocity is very, very important, right? As we were reminded throughout the novel. So so that's like super weird and chilling. But again, to what extent is it a system and to what extent is it Emma being unkind, right? Like, is she right to just say, I could not have done it? I mean, is the system constraining you to that degree? Or would she potentially have the freedom to choose who to associate with?
And also, is she being rhetorical, right? Like, is she saying this in order to further convince Harriet that she must not make this marriage? Because Emma would feel like a failure if, after her intervention, Harriet only married a farmer.
Right.
That's not what she's aiming for in her little project.
She would have failed in her project.
Exactly. So that might be the case, although certainly the text doesn't make me think that that's what she's thinking, but who knows? But yeah, the Bates family.
I find them very interesting. Like, again, they're comic. We talked about Mr. Woodhouse as being a comic relief character. And Miss Bates, the unmarried, middle-aged Miss Bates, is clearly meant to be like a ridiculous character and you laugh at her. But there's also a real poignancy when a situation arises when a whole group of people from the town, including Emma herself, go off on an expedition up to Box Hill, sort of a picnicking expedition. And on that expedition, Emma, she's sort of in a bad mood because of what's going on with Frank Churchill. And she is extremely rude to Miss Bates and kind of humiliates her in front of everybody. And it's passed over and people, like the conversation goes on and so on, but it was really unkind. And Mr. Knightley speaks to her about it. And it's such an interesting scene, I think, because it's an important scene in terms of the relationship of Emma and Mr. Knightley, but it's also important because it's saying something really profound about like how class works and the extent to which it's tied to how much money you have and the extent to which it isn't. Do you find that scene interesting too? I found the whole Bates scene to be really fascinating.
It's really interesting on a number of ways. So first off, Emma's insult, Emma's joke, Emma's little jape at Miss Bates is based on the fact that she doesn't stop talking. Mm-hmm. And every time Miss Bates talks, it's marvelous. Like she talks in this ongoing free-flowing, let's see, I got one here. The best fruit in England, everybody's favorite, always wholesome. These are the finest beds and the finest sorts, delightful to gather for oneself. The only way of really enjoying the morning, decidedly the best time, never tired, every sort of good. Like it just keeps going on and on
She's
and on.
so extra.
It's such stream of consciousness writing 100 years too early, right? Like it's a real stylish flex from Jane Austen. And it's also a very comedic thing, right? Much like Mr. Woodhouse, Miss Bates is there to be funny when she walks on. And she's funny because she doesn't stop talking. And everybody knows this. And they talk about this when she's not there.
Uh-huh.
And she will joke about it sometimes. So Emma makes a very sharp joke about this. Basically, well, you don't ever shut up kind of joke. And it's too sharp.
Mm-hmm.
And later, as you said, Mr. Knightley reprimands her. Were she a woman of fortune, I would leave every harmless absurdity to take its chance. I would not quarrel with you for any liberties of manner. Be as rude as you want if she has money. Were she equal in situation, but Emma, consider how far this is from being the case. She is poor, she has sunk from the comforts she was born to, and if she lived to old age, must probably sink more. Her situation should secure your compassion. So not only is Emma getting reprimanded for not correctly understanding what her position should be, what her class responsibilities are, for failing at the thing that Emma does more than anything, is policing class borders and acting like your class. But also, you need to be sympathetic to this character, a character who has been the butt of jokes for the entire novel, that the reader has been encouraged to laugh at this whole time. And suddenly Jane Austen is providing a character to say, actually, it's not that funny.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Which I think is a really nice trick to play. No, trick may be the wrong word, but it's a really nice move to make towards your reader.
Well, it puts the reader in Emma's position to some extent, where the shame that Emma is going to feel here, you kind of feel it too. In this way, it's one of the very subtle ways in which the novel draws you into her subject position, even unwillingly, over and over again.
Yeah, and also tries to train you to not trust her subject position.
Right.
Emma is very confident about things, and except for one chapter and 1 or 2 paragraphs later on in the novel, everything is basically limited to Emma's perspective.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We get 1 chapter from Mr. Knightley and a few paragraphs from Harriet's point of view. But
it's almost all Emma.
But it's almost all Emma. We see this world through Emma's eyes. She's our guide, and she is not entirely reliable.
Yes, she's often wrong.
Yes.
Not stupid, but wrong.
So there was a movie adaptation of Emma that came out a few months ago, right around the time that the world changed.
Did you see it?
I didn't, but I believe you got to see it.
I did. It was not bad. It was visually really pleasing. The costumes were fantastic. And it was fine. I don't think the screenplay was good. It was But the greatest adaptation of Emma remains, without a doubt, Clueless.
Yes, which I finally broke down and watched just a night or two ago.
Oh my God. How did you like it?
It was, it's tricky to say. It was perfectly fine movie, and there were lots of really interesting things about it. But by far the most interesting thing about it is that it is an adaptation of Emma, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way that they decided to adapt it is fantastic. Both in terms of the little jokes that are very funny if you've just read the novel, little references to things here and there, but also in the sense that what does it mean to do an adaptation of Emma? Why are you doing it?
It's a different place and time, right? So relations and events have to be translated into this other place and time, right?
Exactly. So it felt very honest in that way, even with massive changes in terms of the setting and plot.
Well, because of the massive changes, right? Because they adapt to this other environment and they make it present to us, right?
Yeah. If anyone hasn't seen it, it takes place in the 1990s in California, in high school, basically, and in a very rich and wealthy high school. And so all the characters are basically incredibly wealthy and incredibly class conscious and status conscious and fashion conscious and all that.
And there's all these different cliques and so on. So instead of the town, we have the high school, basically, right?
Exactly. But not everybody is actually all that rich. And the Harriet Smith that comes into the scene.
Transfer student.
Is a transfer student, exactly. You've definitely got some cliques that don't seem to be doing quite as well as Emma is doing with her magnificently apportioned house and her giant clothing closet.
Well, what's striking about her too is not just that she inhabits this sort of exalted clique, but she understands all the cliques. Like she gives this taxonomy of the cliques when she's walking the Harriet character through the high school campus. It's like a chessboard, right? That she thinks she has command of, but she really doesn't have that much command of at all.
Exactly. She is both able to navigate things very well and also kind of not able to navigate anything or sort of she's aware of a certain set of things and deeply unaware, deeply clueless, of course, about another set of things. And so it's like Emma in the novel, right? Where she totally understands some things. She totally overreads a few things. She's absolutely clueless about a few things. And these all play together in really interesting ways.
Yeah, it's neat that they fix on this, as the crucial sort of point of connection with the novel, right? Like, in other words, the moment when I think it's almost in some ways most faithful to the novel is when, in the movie, it's where she's like, oh, I've been completely clueless. And in the novel, there's this moment, like not too far from the end of the book, where she suddenly has knowledge of herself. And this is something that Austen does in her novels with some frequency. Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice has a big moment like this right after she reads an important letter. So here Emma is most sorrowfully indignant, ashamed of every sensation but the one revealed to her, her affection for Mr. Knightley. Every other part of her mind was disgusting. With insufferable vanity had she believed herself to be in the secret of everybody's feelings. With unpardonable arrogance proposed to arrange everybody's destiny. She was proved to have been universally mistaken, and she had not quite done nothing, for she had done mischief. Right, so this is Emma. It's in the third person, but it's Emma saying these things to herself, and it gets translated in the movie to this like kind of monologue about how clueless the Emma character Cher has been. And there's other clever ways in which the movie adapts the novel. Like, so for example, Mr. Knightley and Emma in the novel are 16 years apart. She's like almost 21. He's 37 or 38, right? So now you couldn't just put that into contemporary audiences. You couldn't just use those ages because it'd be like, a slightly weird but adult couple, right? So instead, there's a high school student and a college student. And that is paradoxically, even though it's fewer years, it's a much bigger gap.
Right.
For us.
Yeah. Yeah. And they also maintain or perhaps even highlight the almost brotherly, sisterly, but not quite relationship.
It's not illegal.
Yeah. Like the Knightley character is a stepson of Emma's father from a later marriage or a different marriage anyways. Mm-hmm. So they are not related at all by blood.
But the fundamental, this idea of them having been in the same house growing up.
Yeah, they've known each other for a long time. They've interacted a lot. I don't know whether they ever properly lived together for any stretch of time. And I
think they refer to it in the movie that he had lived there in the past.
He might have, but the Emma character, Cher, is very much like, this is not your house. He's not really your father. Don't act with so much ownership over this space that you're inhabiting. Mm-hmm. At least at first.
And then the greatest adaptation of all, if you ask me, is how they managed the Frank Churchill character. Because you couldn't do this like secret engagement and contracted at the seaside. Like, who would care about this now? So he has a different secret.
Exactly. Which was fun because I was watching the movie with my husband who saw it many times when he was younger. And, two scenes into the film, I turned to him and was like, is he going to be gay? Like, he's reading Junkie by William S. Burroughs. I think I know what that means. And he's like, yeah, I didn't figure that out until much later in the film. And then these scenes kept happening. And I'd be like, did you figure it out by now? And he was like, no. I was a very trusting movie watcher when I was a child.
It's okay. So good. It's so good.
But yeah, it was very good. And also, I will say, in Clueless, the two characters that I actually would want to spend any time with are Ty, the Harriet Smith character, and Travis, the farmer Mr. Martin character. Like, those are the only two appealing characters.
Yeah, who's a huge stoner skateboard dude.
At first, but then he gives it up by the end of the movie.
But he wins the skateboard competition.
Yeah, no, his talents blossom when he gives up the weed. It's great. There's a lot to like about that movie.
Oh my God.
The other thing I was thinking as I was reading this was that it's a bit unfair to read Emma so relatively recently after having read Middlemarch. Because Emma and Middlemarch are two very different novels. Emma is not trying to do what Middlemarch is trying to do, and it's kind of unfair to compare them. But Middlemarch coming however many years later, 50 years later, I forget. Mm-hmm. Middlemarch reads as if George Eliot had looked at Emma and thought, okay, but what if we took this seriously? What if we weren't just trying to write a comedy novel of relations and screwballness and whatnot? I guess it's not quite screwball, but a novel of comedy and a novel of interpersonal relationships that go awry and people misunderstanding each other. What if we made it for real? And what if we, instead of having these sort of character actor type characters who are, there for comic relief, what if everybody had a redeeming quality to them? What if everybody was richly written?
Yeah. And when you say that, it really brings out the ways in which this novel, like, even though on the one hand, it's about a person, right? It's about Emma, but it's also about that town. It's also about like this kind of, I don't know, ecosystem of people in a way that I think is different from all of Austen's other novels.
Yeah, and I think there's a sense in which, again, like this is totally unfair, but Middlemarch makes it feel like Emma missed a few tricks.
Well.
It does some really interesting things. There's a town shop, Ford's, which acts at times like a central meeting place for characters.
It's so interesting.
It's totally interesting. It's totally interesting how the characters relate to this shop when it comes up.
Well, because people who are in different class layers can intersect. Like people run into each other there, right?
Exactly. But it still feels like it could have been a bit more fleshed out. It sort of only occurs for a few chapters of the novel. And it really made me want to see it gone into with the depth and care that George Eliot brought to things in Middlemarch. There's just so much potential here in a way that for a completely different type of novel to be read in a completely different way, right? It just feels like Middlemarch is a kind of evolved form of Emma. I don't want to say that in the sense that it's like a better novel. It's a different novel, but it's playing with some of the same materials.
Well, a neat way to think about that is to see in Emma, which is, again, as we said before, the last novel that Austen sees published in her lifetime, that there's this potentiality, like there's this direction she could have gone in if she'd had more time.
Well, that's certainly the case. If she'd lived another 20, 30, 40 years, maybe the sense of what a novel is and is for would have changed, and she would have gone with it, and she would have led that change, and it could have been quite interesting. I think she would have been able to do it.
Virginia Woolf has an essay on Jane Austen where she makes exactly that point. I'm sure other writers do too, but just this whole question of what kinds of things might have been possible. What can we imagine? What can we infer? What can we know about what's not there from what's there?
Oh, excellent. We will put a link to that essay and some other really interesting essays on Emma in the show notes, as we always do. What is the next book that we're going to be doing?
Great Expectations.
Oh, so great. We'll see. We'll see if they're great. I can't remember if I've read this one before.
It's actually pretty pleasurable. There are some neat moments in that.
Oh, good. As I've mentioned, I'm not really a big fan of Dickens, but every so often I give him another try. And I did watch a movie version of this not too long ago.
I haven't seen any movies of it.
It's a very old movie that I saw. It was pretty good, if definitely of its era. Anyway, so I'm excited to give it another try and see if this time I can really properly appreciate Dickens finally.
Well, or at least find interesting things in it. Like if we're focusing on class, as part of the cluster of 3 novels, thinking about how he's navigating that, because he's in a totally different position relative to where Austen is, and it's a different moment in time. And the 19th century, stuff is changing fast on the ground, right? And he's talking about the city of London a lot, and that's a totally different scene as well.
Exactly. No, I'm super excited to read it for that reason. Just whether I will read it with pleasure is the question. But we'll find out next time around. Until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We would always love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/28. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.